Hey everybody, I'd love to introduce Werner Rammert from Technical University of Munich, who's been focusing on process-based models of forest across the world. Welcome, Werner.
Hi everyone. So, okay, so the name of my talk today is Simulation of Forest Ecosystems Across Scales. It will be about forests, and it will cover some process-based modeling approaches, but also then some data-driven AI-based scaling approaches. My background is I'm from the Ecosystem Dynamics and Forest Management Group at TU Munich, so this is really more or less between forestry, classical forestry, and ecology. I'd like to start with a bit of motivation why I am interested in modeling forests. So one of the main points is that forests are just super important. So it's 30% of global land area is covered by forests, and it's a lot of trees, trillions of them. And they are really important for a lot of services that we want and have from forests. So it's important for biodiversity. So 3/4 of all known species living on land are forest dwelling. And it's very important for freshwater provisioning. And of course, in today, it's the whole climate discussion. So the amount of carbon that is stored in forests is in a ballpark roughly the same as in the atmosphere. And on the screen, you see the famous Keeling curve of ticking up CO2 concentrations on and on. And this is also one of the main motivations that we want to model forests, because we want to see and study what their future might look like. Just a little recap. So to see how dramatic the changes have been already in the last 100 plus years. What you see now is temperatures basically color-coded by how much they have risen already. And what you see when we come to the 2000 and in the last 2 decades, it's just going up, and it's getting warmer and warmer. And this is very likely going to continue. And this is interesting from the context from the lifespan of a tree, which is maybe 100 years and maybe even longer. So the trees that are now old have experienced a way different climate conditions when they were young, and species that are established today will have a very different future in the future. So this is also something that is very particular to forests. And with changing climate, other processes change as well, and we are quite interested in what we call forest disturbances. These are these pulses of tree mortality that are caused by bark beetles, for instance, or other biotic agents. What you see here is a picture of a large-scale bark beetle outbreak where just a lot of tree dies in a very short span of time, so within months, maybe within a year. Of course, you know all the pictures of forest fires that are increasing and which are known to be quite sensitive to climate. And a third important disturbance agent is storms and wind. For instance, in Europe, it's typically the most important disturbance agents that we have. Yeah, and I said climate is changing, and with that, other processes that adapt and change. So, for instance, in Europe, forest disturbances have already increased. So, in the last 30 years, it's an increase of about 20 to 30%. So, on average, 1% per year. And this is basically when we look back from on remote sensing data sets and analysis of disturbances based on Landsat images. So the question is, and here forest modeling comes into the game, how will that continue in the future? So for this, I want to just very briefly cover a little bit of history of forest model. So the whole process started somewhere in the 1970s. So basically, this was basically the first forest modeling paper that I'm aware of. It's is the Jabova model from Dan Botkin, 1972. And from then on, different kind of models have been developed, also for very different goals and very different aims. So this really spreads from models that look at individual trees and look at branching patterns and whatnot, to the stand scale, which is very, very common in forestry. So this is about maybe 1 hectare or so. So the typical thing that you want to do in forest management, you look at homogeneous forests, pictures if you are in a forest and look around. This is roughly the stand scale. And this goes up to global vegetation models that simulate forests at scales of single degree cells or 100 kilometer cells, where the vegetation is just, green slime or a pool of carbon or whatever. And in these developments that have been going on since 50 years, a lot have changed recently, and a lot has to do actually with computation. So it's, on the one hand, it's this crazy increase in the availability of remote sensing based products from satellite, aerial images, and so on. It's also the increase in compute. So now models that we have nowadays would not have been possible 20 years ago. And there is this AI thing, which might also change a little bit on how we do forest modeling. What we as a group, or I am personally, we're always focusing on is the landscape scale. And this, it's not super deep. The definition of landscape scale is not super crisp, but you can think about a landscape as maybe a watershed, an area of maybe 100 square kilometers to 500 square kilometers. So something that is a smaller national park, a watershed. So this is the level that I want to talk about. And why is this level important? On the one hand, it's just the processes that are interesting and are very prominent on that level. So it's still very much in the individual trees do something era. It's a lot about the spatial interactions. So think about, I don't know, insects spreading on the landscape. If you just look at a single stand, 1 hectare, this is just not big enough. If you have larger scale processes that are going on. And from a human perspective, this is typically also the level where you do management. So maybe a forest company runs one of those landscapes and they want to think about how to manage what and what to do when. So I will talk about landscape scale modeling and landscape modeling at the level of individual trees. And this is something that is relatively novel because individual trees are more, computationally demanding and so on. This has not been done like in the 90s. This was just not possible. But today we can do that. So the main motivation and maybe also the challenge is the triangle of climate, vegetation, and disturbance. So this is also something that is, as I said in the intro, this is the real big drivers that we have. We have these changing climate conditions that change forests a lot, and we have these advent of disturbances of wind and fire and so on. So to be really process-based, to be really climate sensitive, you need to incorporate some processes. So it's not working very well to just use statistical relationships that are fit on past data. You need to include the processes of tree growth and so on to being able to capturing climate change signals. You need to have you want to have individual-based resolution, because this is the competition between trees is actually something that happens between single trees, and this is much easier to get data on and think about individual trees interacting. And last but not least, if you want to really look at disturbances, you need to go to landscape scale, because this is really the scale that matters most for disturbances. And also from a personal perspective, it's much easier to think about individual trees that are sitting somewhere on the landscape experiencing the environment and doing something, then compared to an abstract thing like a cohort of trees or a cell of vegetation. And this is basically the background of iLand, the model that this is Rupert Seidel and me, have been working on for a long time. We started development 15 years ago, at the time where it was clear that data is getting online more and more, and compute is getting better. So we started to work on that time. The main thing, and this is what I want to talk about in the next couple of minutes. I don't want to give you super details about how the model works, but maybe just give you some impressions on which levels and how you can just imagine the individual elements interacting. So in a nutshell, it really works a little bit like these Russian dolls that you see here. So there are different levels that are somehow interacting. So it's down on the bottom is the individual tree scale. So this is really the processes that act on individual trees, growth of trees, interaction, competition for resources. Then one level up, also spatially, there is this stand scale, which is in for iLand the hectare, so the 100 by 100 meters. And here a lot of the ecophysiological processes are run, like water cycling and so on. And then there's the landscape scale, where a number of processes are working on or running. So this is how a tree looks like in iLand. So it's actually quite simple. Needs to be, so it's sitting somewhere. It has a location. It has a size and dimension, like the diameter, which is a very important measure in forestry. And there is the tree crown, which has a specific shape, which depends on the tree species. So this is the tree. If you look at it from a more carbon perspective, a tree consists of a number of pools, of carbon pools or biomass pools. So this is the foliage, the branches and twigs, the stem, the coarse roots, and the fine roots. Fine roots are just very little roots that are basically doing the job of taking up nutrients and water. And this is, I mean, it's an overview graph of some of the main processes that are implemented in the model. No, don't worry, I won't be guiding you through all the processes. I just want to look at one. And this is one where I would, where the novelty of the iLand approach is basically at home. And this is this one, the circuit one. This is basically competition for light. Traditionally, this is always a little computationally a little hard because a lot of trees are interacting, and it's not so easy to find a way that the trees and the crowns in 3D space can be calculated. And what we thought is that we just would see the trees as very similar. All the trees on the landscapes, they share a similar properties. They have similar sizes, or some of them have similar sizes, and they are basically they are repeated many times on the landscape. So if you have a tree of a certain size, this one tree with that specific crown could be thousands of times on the landscapes, more or less. And so we started from this basically observation, and then tried to pre-compute basically the influence of a tree with a certain dimension on its surrounding. So rather than computing it always within the computational loop of the model, we kind of put out the computation and put it in a kind of a library. So what we did is basically related to a ray tracing approach. So you look at 3D voxels and quantify how much light is not available in that voxel because of the tree in the middle. And this would then give you data for one time one day because the sun is moving, of course. And what we can do computationally is basically integrate that over time, over the full vegetation period, and integrate this effect on the neighborhood. And what you end up with in the end is something like this. So this is a pattern, what we call light influence pattern. This basically tells you where the bars are high, there's a lot of shading going on, and it's a little higher in north direction, at least on the northern hemisphere. So it's sensitive to also the direction of the orientation of the tree. Yep, and you can create a lot of those patterns in advance. It's not taking very long, but then you can compile a library, yeah, which is actually very simple. It's just these pre-compiled patterns. Here you just see that they actually really look different depending on the species, on the y-axis, and also on tree size. So they have different characteristics. And when you have interacting trees, then what the model does, it's basically superimposing all those patterns on each other, and which creates a kind of superimposed field. This is visualized down here. Just try to get the pointer. So down here, this is what it's called light influence field. So this is the superimposed field of influences of trees, and for a single tree, the influence of the tree itself is then excluded, and then like a light value for a tree can be calculated. And from that on, this is then the next step, the amount of light, which is paramount for the production of biomass and for photosynthesis, is then derived from that value. The advantage of that is it's fast and it scales well. So we did some comparisons with existing models that did complex ground geometries and light calculations. They work, but usually their approaches oftentimes do not scale well with the size of the landscape. So this is what you see here in the graph in log scale. And the approach that iLand is using, like the superimposing of light influence grids, this scales, I would say, perfectly linearly, and is therefore very nice for scaling up landscape sizes.
So question.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So I mean, this is a lookup table kind of technique where you say you have a kind of expensive model and it's low dimensionality. So you just say, cache the results of that, the histogram essentially. What I'm wondering about is, to what extent does this depend on slope and so on? Like how heterogeneous are its applications of such a model? Or to what extent can you just say it's the same pattern stamped everywhere? Maybe you don't even need to have a landscape. It's all kind of a homogeneous landscape. Because how complex and dynamic of a pattern is this?
Yeah. So for the patterns, what we do is actually really use the same pattern regardless of slope.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, I mean, you could say this is a little bit of a problem, but in the end, if you really look at tree crowns and how they are interacting, in the end, it's probably not too much of an error. Most of the landscape variation that is then in the end in the model is based on different climate and so on, and different light, global light that's coming in, which is basically part of the climate data, which influences then also the light that each tree experiences. Mm-hmm. So elevation or slope does not really count. So typically we have, I don't know, a couple of thousand of those patterns per tree species that are then used for calculations.
Okay, and then to what extent can you start summarizing? So you're summarizing some of these patterns. To what extent do you need a landscape model? What I'm asking about is the pattern of trees tends to be pretty homogeneous, and that's actually the error. Like how homogeneous, where you may just say, well, it's the same tree stand over and over and over. I'm going to just do that, or you actually have a bunch of trees and use these patterns to have them impact each other, but really keep the locations of the trees. What's the right way?
Really, this is just for this interaction between trees that are neighboring each other. Maybe here in this figure, you see a typical structure. You have gaps, you have little trees and big trees, and not different species here, but the actual landscape of trees is actually quite complex and is influenced by all the processes that are running on the landscape. So this is just the way how the interaction between trees is translated into the competition of trees with each other.
Okay. And then, yeah, how does that translate over? So you've done light. What about groundwater? Because it seems like they would also drink in this kind of dependent way.
Pardon? I didn't get it.
Groundwater, because their root structures will interact in water in similar ways to how canopies interact in light.
Yeah. It's a very good question. So the water, I mean, here these effects are just kind of separated. So this is now light, and for instance, the water, the groundwater uptake is a different process. This is handled differently in the model, but it's also playing a role in how well trees grow.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
But it's a simplification with regard to the shapes of the ground. So that the trees are assumed to have the same species-dependent ground shape, regardless of the actual growing conditions.
Right, makes sense.
Okay, now I want to walk you quickly through some of the main processes that are in the model, in addition to the light. So the main demographic processes in forest ecology is growth, regeneration, and mortality. So it's basically trees that grow and take up biomass and so on, trees that regenerate, distribute seeds, and little trees are growing, and the mortality of trees. It's relatively brief, and just to give you an idea on how things work in iLand. So tree growth, really, these are the main factors that affect tree growth. So it's direct climate input data, temperature, vapor pressure deficit, CO2, and so on. The light that we talked about, the competition status, and the availability of water and nutrients. And from this, an annual increment is calculated. I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. And the annual increment is basically this GPP minus respiration and minus turnover. And this is then distributed to these compartments that I talked about. So some of those kilograms of carbon goes then into foliage, some of it goes into roots, and so on. And there is some dynamics in that. So for instance, a tree invests more carbon in the root system if the growing conditions are difficult. And for instance, if a tree has very heavy competition by neighboring trees, they tend to invest more in height growth just to keep being in the light, so to say. The second part is tree mortality, and there are several ways that trees can die in the model. So one is basically a random tree death, which really is parameterized from one parameter, which is maximum tree age. And this process includes all different kinds of mortality, from your random lightning strike to other illnesses that a tree could have. And in addition to this intrinsic base level mortality comes stress-related mortality. And this is really the thing when trees are just not able to accumulate enough carbon to continue working well. So this is basically a carbon balance. So if the tree needs more biomass to renew its trees, renew its leaves, and so on, then it's stressed and has a higher probability of dying. So and if a tree has not enough water, not enough light, not enough nutrients, this all plays together in this kind of stress index that a tree has. And disturbance processes, I will talk about them in a minute. Another big part is tree regeneration. So this is the process from your adult large tree to little trees on the landscape, and here it follows the main stages. So the one is the production of seeds. Basically, adult trees produce seeds. They are then distributed on the landscape, and then there are establishment filters, basically deciding on which locations it's suitable for a seed to establish into a tree. On stand level, and this is now the processes on this 100 by 100 meters. There, the ecophysiological processes are running. So this is then the interception of radiation. Of course, this also relates to the single tree geometries of the crowns, but also the production of carbohydrates, the MPP, and how environment plays into tree growth. And here's the water, the dryness, the nutrients, and so on. And for this, we basically use the 3PG model from Landsberg and Waring, which is a simple but greatly working model for tree physiology. The water cycle is also important to have. This in iLand, it's relatively simple. It's basically simulates the soil water storage as one bucket, so to say. It's a single bucket model, but it includes the main processes. There's precipitation from above. There's evapotranspiration, simulated with a Penman-Montes equation, and there is runoff, and of course there's this tree uptake. And the feedback to tree growth is basically if the water content in the soil goes down, this limits evapotranspiration, and this limits then how much carbon can be taken up in the atmosphere. And maybe also important, this is the water cycle process is running on a daily basis. So this is a daily time step. Okay, so we already discussed some of the boxes here in this diagram, but now I just very quickly want to talk about disturbances in management, because these are important landscape level processes. And iLand, as I said before, disturbances were one of the main important drivers for model development. So there are models for wind, bark beetles as a biotic agent, and wildfire, and a very general system for biotic agents. And there is a forest management module, which is quite detailed and allows to do silvicultural intervention in a very detailed way on the landscape and on single stands, and extracting single trees and so on. So maybe just very briefly how this. Yeah. Was there a question? Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay. Very briefly, how these disturbances are implemented in such a process-based, individual-based model. So, for instance, wind. This is really based on physical understanding. So, on canopy edges, there are empirical equations that tell you how much force is asserted by a wind of a certain speed. And this is translated to turning moments, how much stress can a stem of a tree take if a given dimension. And if a tree breaks or is uprooted, then this disturbance process continues iteratively to go over the landscape, and this can then create patterns like this on the picture here, where the trees start falling at some edge, and then the trees continue falling over and over. And so this is a kind of a spread perspective for these bark beetles. And here we have, I need to say, the European spruce bark beetle, because it's the most important bark beetle that we have in Europe. So it's not the North American bark beetle that you had a lot of troubles with. It's also quite detailed and process oriented. So it actually calculates the physiology of the beetles based on climate drivers. So how many generations the beetle can have in one vegetation period. Okay. So I was talking about the biotic agent, so the spruce bark beetle, and how the generations are calculated. But then it's quite detailed how the beetles are spreading in the landscape. So when they infect trees, they fly out of that and are looking for other trees that they can infest. it's based on a 10-meter resolution, and it's quite close to process that we know scientifically. And it's also interesting because in Europe there is a lot of interaction between these biotic disturbances and wind. So what happens in a lot of the times, you have some wind, some storm damages in the forest, and where you have the storm, in the years after the storm, the beetles are very happy and grow and spread in the landscape.
So question.
Yep.
How does there's a spatial pattern here, also wildfire. I guess how are these notably different from each other? Because you're trying to be very spatially explicit about them. But how are the different threats spread, speed, shape, impact on like topography?
Yeah. So this is a little different depending on the disturbance agent. So for instance, the spread of fire, this here the slope and the specific elevation aspects have a role. So fire burns up slope usually more than down slope. But this is all baked into empirical relations, and all is, you can imagine it as really a kind of a cellular automaton thing of process. So also the beetles, the spread, and when they find trees of the right species, then they go into that, and a new round starts, and in the next year it can continue, and so on. So these processes really run on quite. So if you imagine a landscape of say 20,000 hectares, and you have the spatial resolution for bark beetles like 10 meter, and for wind I think it's 20, then you have these core processes where actual trees are affected are very small compared to the full landscape extent.
Right. And then, so you focus on bark beetle, but then how do the different kinds of bugs, how are they different from each other, and how do you even detect them well enough to make a model?
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic. So there are some of those critters that are very well known for a long time. For instance, the Ips typographus, the spruce bark beetle, there's a lot of knowledge about that. And we were able to build a quite detailed model of that. And there's a lot of research that went in on the physiology of the beetle. For other biotic agents, it's much more difficult. And I showed you that we included a submodule. It's called BITE. It's really about handling all these biotic agents where you just have less information. And this is an approach where we say, okay, if you have very little information, then you can at least put the stuff that you know into the life cycle of the critter, and keep it relatively simple. But it's true specifically for invasive new agents. There's usually quite a time window between you get the new beetle from, I don't know, from somewhere into your country, and until you really have good evidence about how this beetle behaves, maybe with new tree species, this just takes a while, and you need to ramp up or gather the data that you need when you want to build a very detailed model of it.
Right. Now, if you have an invasive tree species, an invasive species like a tree species that is invading, to what extent is it just another tree that's in your forest, but that you've not seen before?
If you have a new tree species, then it's basically unused. So a tree species is basically parameterized with I don't know, 60 or 70 traits. So it's actually, this would be no problem, and you can have multiple species on a landscape, and this would just be a new species on the landscape. So the thing is maybe that you need the knowledge and the data for it. But if it's coming from somewhere, then you can have the species traits information from there.
Okay.
So this is also, I mean, for us, usually it's more important to have these biotic agents that are threatening existing populations of tree species. But also, as you refer to, it's also important to look at new tree species and for instance, how do North American tree species interact or work in other, I don't know, Europe, for instance.
Right. So one more thing on this topic. Yeah, I mean, I'll think of the example species, maybe Prosopis, which is like, in Eastern Africa right now, or India, where the spread model is what I'm going to ask about, where it spreads via things like floods, which takes the pods, shoves them somewhere distant, it regrows. Or animals eat it, walk around, dump it, which I guess would be pretty common for trees. How do you deal with these long-range dispersals in a model like this?
Yeah, but I mean, for the typical spread of not is usually done with distribution kernels. So this is the normal way. And when you have long disturbance, long distance distribution, then you would just need to have a very long tail for these kernels. I mean, the situation that you described now, that you need a river, for instance, or a flood, or some very specific spatial feature, this might complicate things a little. Technically, you could always limit or use some pre-computed GIS maps for that, but it's not typically so easy.
Right. It makes sense. All right, cool. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. Time's running. So iLand has been developed mostly in Europe and North America. So most of the pins are there. And what you see from the map of regions where we applied iLand, it's mostly about temperate forests and boreal forests. So we have not yet tapped into Mediterranean, subtropical or tropical forests, and it might be difficult because of the way we did the processes and implemented all these interactions is geared a little towards how forests work in temperate and boreal zones. Yeah, that's basically it. So it's an open source model, which was not the way everyone did it like 15 years ago. So nowadays, I think it's pretty much open source is the standard. When we started, this was kind of new, and we have a very detailed documentation and wiki, and a growing group of users that are learning the model and applying the model. Okay, so for the second part, I want to talk about how we approach the scaling up question, because as I mentioned, the landscape level is important if you want to look at the detailed interactions between trees and beetles and whatnot. But it's if you want to have some results on larger scale, you need some way to go. And this is just to give you an impression of the different scales. So starting from the single tree resolution up to, I don't know, country and continental scale. So where we start with iLand is basically somewhere here. So we have the simple single tree, and this is then represented by an abstraction. So basically this pattern that I talked about. And iLand goes maybe up to this landscape scale. And what we do with the machine learning based scaling, it's called scaling vegetation dynamics. So this SVD will come up a couple of times. It's basically a very similar idea. So you take stands and stances, I'll talk about that in a minute, and represent different stands as individual states, and I'll talk about that also. So this is a very different approach from that you typically have when you say, I don't know, a global vegetation model, and you have very large cells that you run your processes on. Then you would develop these processes and parameterize them on these larger scale cells. What we do here is really trying to upscaling from the tree resolution via some intermediate steps to something larger. So this is keep that in mind. Maybe the way we do it, basically this modeling of these abstracted forest states is a state and transition approach, which is of course not new. Vegetation is always seen as discrete, so discrete states that transition over time between those states, which takes some time and so on. And of course, they can be probabilistic, and they can diverge, and they can develop in very different ways. So this is the basic concept. State and transition, it's around since ages. Maybe the a little different from the typical application of a state and transition approach is the definition of states, and much more the number of states that we handle. So when we define states, we typically look at 3 dimensions that are important for forests. So the one is composition, so it's the tree species that are there and how much of those species are there. It's the structure, and we use the canopy height or the top canopy height for that, and some indication of functioning. So in our case, it's leaf area index or density. And the reason for using those 3 is also that there's a better chance to get information for those 3 based on remote sensing products. So basically, a state is defined as the combination of those 3 things. And it could be, just here an example, FASI, this Fagus sylvatica, this would be the European beech, for instance, dominated by a European beech in a certain size class and a sparse density. So this could be one state. The advantage of such a structure that pre-computes the possible state combination, it's relatively easy also to interpret. So if you ask a forester, how do you imagine such a forest? Typically, they can do this very well. It's relatively fine-grained. So your normal state and transition models, they may have 10 or 20 states. With that approach, it goes up to the 5,000 or 20,000 different states. And I mentioned it before, it's compatible with remote sensing data. And the core of this state and transition model is always the transitions between states. And here, of course, here lies also the problem, because the transition from one state to another is influenced by many different things. The state itself, how long it's already in that state, climate drivers, site conditions, soil depth, and so on. But also the spatial context, so how are the neighbors looking like? And all that together is basically quite a complex equation. And yeah, so I think in this group, I don't want to need to introduce machine learning and deep learning too much, but what we do is we basically use supervised deep learning for the job to estimate probability piece of state transitions. So what it does basically, what we do is we use a process-based model, the PBM here, and run a lot of simulations on smaller scales, and create a huge pile of training data, which then a DNN is trained on. And it really learns to predict the transitions between vegetation classes based on the environmental drivers. So this is, in essence, a meta-modeling approach where the DNN is much, much simpler structurally than the underlying process-based model, but learns at least the most important also responses, for instance, to climate change. And in applying yep.
So this is a simplified approximation of the iLand model.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, got it.
Yeah. In application, it basically looks like this. You have your cell, you have the DNN, and you put all the stuff into the DNN that's driving currently the simulation. So it's the climate and site and so on, but also the neighbors. And then you predict a probability distribution of next state and transition time in our case, which then feeds back to the landscape. And this is basically done in parallel on the whole landscape. And this then runs on a grain of 1 hectare. So it's this 100 by 100 meter cells on an annual time step. And this can be used to, run on relatively large scales. And I'd like to show you 2 examples, maybe very quickly, because the time is running quickly. One is from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and here it's about fire. So because there has been an increase in fire activity, but it's still predicted to continue, that more fires and larger fires will be under climate change. And the question was for that project, how resilient is the current forest type to future climate conditions? So how well can they regenerate? So if you think about fires getting larger and larger, it's getting increasingly a problem to get seeds for the species in, and if it's too hot, it's harder for seedlings to establish. And so this kind of disturbance thing, this is then a second pathway. So the pathway that I described before, so up there, this is more this year-to-year slow forest development, and disturbances, they are then rapid transition. So if you think of a fire, it just goes from there's a forest here to there is no forest here very quickly. And similarly, you can think about human disturbances like forest management. And for this, you need some kind of fire modeling. And what we did here is basically take a lot of the logic from iLand, which is based on fire BGC, essentially, and include that in into that model, which is driven by the DNN. And the application pipeline looks very, very similar. You have stand-level simulations that produce training data. Then you have the DNN training phase, and we are using TensorFlow for that, by the way. And then you can run the scaling vegetation dynamics model on the full landscape. So I can show you this here. So this is 3 million hectares of forest, and the colors are different forest types. Now the simulation runs, and the red are the big fires that are popping up. It's a climate change scenario, so the fire's intensity is increasing. And if for 30 years no regeneration is happening on cells, then they're turning black, meaning that the current forest type is not able to regenerate. So this is a relatively extreme climate change scenario, and you have a lot of black area in the end. So where you could argue that maybe the future forest state in those regions in the Rocky Mountains could look very differently when the current climate change and fire trends are continuing. And this is also what this results show, particularly under dry conditions, hot and dry conditions like the red box on the right. This can be quite dramatic. So this is one application scenario. And the second that I want to talk about is forest disturbances in Europe. So I showed you before this figure of increasing disturbances historically. So the question is, how will this continue into the future? And for this, we basically use the same approach, but instead of just using iLand and one model, we collected from the scientific community data from a bunch of models and combined all those data to one DNN. So for instance, we had partners that run process-based models in the Mediterranean area, in Spain, for instance, because iLand is not running well there. So we use other models, and all the models are then compiled into one training data set. And this basically means that the DNN is then also kind of integrating different modeling approaches. And again, using this SVD approach, we can then simulate dynamically into the future. And as I showed it before, for fire, we also implemented disturbance modules, like spatially explicit disturbance modules for wind and bark beetles. And it's always like a combination of empirical data and process-based principles. So time is going. So basically, it's using remote sensing derived information about historic data to reconstruct some of the relationships. For instance, if it's the relationship between how often it burns and the dryness, the vapor pressure deficit in that area. So this is based on statistics, based on historical data, and this is then built together with some process understanding. And this depends a little on the disturbance agents. But for instance, for wind, which is quite logical, wind is more, or wind damage is more probable if trees are taller and if it's conifers. So there is a different effect of a wind event on the landscape. So there is a lot of feedback. So for instance, if you have a lot of fire, then you just not have enough trees left to let you continuing the fire spread. And this then, also these disturbance modules plus the DNN-based meta model together is then run for Europe, basically. This is then really one step up from the GYE example that I showed before. So Europe, continental scale, it's about 150 million cells, and it's running on an annual time step. I just want to show you some results. So if you look at disturbance rate, so this is basically the percentage of area that is affected by disturbances in a year. So this is the total results for Europe. So also quite clear is that particularly in the south, the rates are much higher, which is driven mostly by fire. And if you look at the difference between like short-term future and long-term future, you see it's a little bit of a mixed picture. You have areas where the projections actually go down a little, like in Central Europe, but very much not in other regions. And if you look at the timeline of the simulations, you see that the disturbance rates, at least under stronger climate drivings, are expected to increase a lot. So they have been increasing in the last years already by quite some, but are projected to increase to double even under strong emission scenarios. Yeah, so basically the same result. So higher temperatures, drier summers lead to higher disturbance rates, also in this continental scale simulations. And if you look at different disturbance agents, it depends a little on the agent that you look at. So fire, I said it already, is very climate sensitive, and here the strong climate change scenario, RCP 8.5, has a very strong effect. Wind, at least in the scenario data that we had, is not really changing with climate, but you see here it's quite some variation. You have single years with quite big storms, and the bark beetle is somewhere in between, but there is a strong interaction between wind and bark beetle, also on continental scale. Well, this brings me basically to the end. So I think there has been quite some progress in computational forestry in the last 50 years at least, and it's also quite fast in the recent past. So the forest models are improving, the data sets are improving, there's remote sensing, and there is more compute in AI. This is good. So this allows us to go into relatively detailed projections about the future, including climate change, disturbances, and so on, and get to relatively high resolution results on large scales. And all that can be used for, looking at what's the impact of these changes on climate, what's the impact of climate on the forests, the provisioning of ecosystem services. And this is also can be used as tools for management. So if you have a grip on how future forests could develop, then you could also design your management treatments accordingly. Maybe a quick outlook. So currently we have a bunch of colleagues in the US that are working in a larger project on fire. It's the Western Fire Forest Resilience Collaborative, and they are using basically the same set of models that I presented here to get a larger scale, quite detailed fire future for the west of US and Canada. And my last point, we are using TensorFlow called from a C++ program, and this really sucks on Windows, at least since a couple of years. So I don't know if someone is listening. It would be nice to have a working TensorFlow binary again. With this, I want to thank you for this quite overtime presentation. Thanks a lot.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much. But let me ask you one major question here. So the strength of a process model is that you can account for, well, a century of knowledge about forests inside the dynamics you have. But how do you calibrate it against like the new data sets we have, like the underground inventories, satellite data, which now can go down to individual trees? So is it possible to parameterize landscape models from, well, pictures or records of the whole landscapes?
So typically it's always a mix. So the behavior of trees, this is calibrated and parameterized based on very detailed information from growth trials and so on. The vegetation itself, so how the vegetation looks like at the beginning of a simulation, this is typically coming from inventory data, and a mix of inventory data and remote sensing. So you will not have a perfect tree fit from reality to your model, but it's working quite well to get the overall forest types and the overall composition quite right. So you can look at height canopy maps from remote sensing. You can have inventory points, and then you need some data manipulation magic to come up with the tree vegetation in the end.
But then we seem to have pretty much all the data required to actually align the state of a model against reality. Now, of course, there's stochasticity or just details of each tree that cannot be, well, they're not the same thing, but you should be able to at least align them and do like weather models. You can have ensembles of weather models that, you can tune the ensemble around live measurements, and that kind of works. So is there an opportunity to align your models against live data or historical data?
Yeah, what we do usually when we evaluate models or the models, this is we use it against historical data. So we use historical climate data records. We use vegetation information from the past and run models and look if the development is right. This is really part of the normal evaluation and calibration procedures.
Right.
Of course, it's running into the future is much more difficult.
Of course,
for obvious reasons, but we try what we can have, and it's really a mix. So on the very different levels to get data that you can compare with. So for instance, for tree growth, there is a long tradition of tree growth trials and repeated measurements. So this works quite well. For ecophysiological parameters, it's also quite okay, but of course there are some areas which are less certain or which come with a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, sounds good. Well, then thank you very much. This is very valuable.
Yeah. So then I'll jump back from the presentation. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was fun, and maybe I'll join in the future for one of the.
Oh, that would be fantastic to have you. Thank you.